They need to predict where the chip needs to land.
And that's the dream. Land in Shenzhen, you walk into Huacheng Bay, you find some guy and he takes you down a back alley and says, all right, we'll make it for you, come back in a week.
On the cloud side, they can definitely do it. Great, works fine. But then something that needs to be added on the hardware side, suddenly everything changed. Welcome to Supply Chain. I'm John from Asianometry.
I'm Tim Culpin from Culpium.
Tim, I had a friend visit the other day. And, we sat and we were talking and chatting. And he's from the Bay Area. And one of the things that we started getting to talk about was just how different these two areas between, the Bay and Taiwan, the supply chain and hardware side, just really, they don't really mesh.
The original Silicon Valley and the new Silicon Valley, yeah.
The new literal Silicon Valley, correct, yeah.
Yeah.
And I wanted to talk today a little bit about just how wide this gulf is and why this gulf exists, right?
It's different mentality, isn't it? It's really software versus hardware.
It's a software versus hardware thing, and I
think fast, break things versus slow and patient, be deliberate. Very different thinking.
Yeah. So I wanted to ask you a little bit, what are some of the things that, software developers from the Bay, of which there are a few within our audience, should know about kind of what does it mean to make hardware?
Well, I think you could answer this as well as I, but I think one of the most obvious things is you don't get to do an in-field software update when you're doing hardware.
Right.
And that sounds obvious, but when you're designing hardware, it's a very long process. And once it's out, it's out. And I think a lot of people, I know people who've started startups and decided they're going to go and make the hardware product from scratch. And I guess for some reason, they thought it was easy. And they forget that, for every little part, there's a separate mold, a separate set of tooling. And just one of those molds could be wrong, or the tool's going to be, a little bit out of alignment, and the plastic or the metal comes out a little bit awry, and you've got to redo that process. And it's not something you do overnight. Even in Taiwan or China, where they do it really quickly, it still can take a few days to weeks. And you multiply that out by dozens of different parts that go into a hardware product, you can really drag out timelines. You don't get to do some kind of weekend sprint like you can in software. It's hard. You don't know it until you've actually been in that process and had to iterate through the process of making a product.
Let's say, I'm X company. I want to make some new widget, right? Let's say I want to make this new AI sensing clip.
Mm-hmm.
And then I think, okay, I want to make this thing. I don't know. I have an idea of a concept, and I'm going to fly over to Asia to get it done. How does that process work? And what does that mean actually once you land? It's how does that, don't they just handle all of it? You just tell them what they do and they go make it?
Yeah, they can, and they will charge you accordingly, and they'll do it according to what they're thinking of, not necessarily what you're thinking of. And that's the dream. You just land in Shenzhen, you walk into Huacheng Bay, you find some guy and he takes you down a back alley and says, all right, we'll make it for you, come back in a week. Theoretically, but it'll be their conception of what you want. And if that's the case, then it's probably already out there and your hardware product is not unique. So the idea of doing a new hardware product is you want something unique. And there's two parts to it. One is the electronics, right? The chips, the motherboard, all of that. The other one is the mechanical, which is the physical incarnation of the device. And that's, for a smartphone, it's like the front casing, the back casing, how it all works physically. And for many other hardware products, like a microphone or a camera, it could be the physical lens, casing and design, all those things. That's the mechanical. It's the stuff that doesn't have any electric running through it. That's really hard as well. It's actually, in many ways, harder than the electronics, because a lot of the electronics is kind of pre-made, pre-designed. And so the first thing that anyone wanting to do hardware should learn is don't reinvent the wheel. If there's off-the-shelf components, chip, motherboards, modules, any of that that's available, take it. Just take whatever is already available and use it in your own way. And also the same for hardware. If somebody's already got some kind of casing or design that you can use, take it. It doesn't make you less special, because if your product is any good, you've got something on the back end, like the software or the services or something else that goes into it. So the number one thing I would say is don't try and reinvent everything from scratch.
One of the things that I remember thinking about when people talking about designing chips and making chips is like they always talk about like they need to kind of predict where the chip needs to land in the next year or 2 years, right?
Yeah.
And that's kind of like one of the hardest parts to think about when you are making a hardware product. Like you have to actually predict where these things are going, and then like there's a timeline, and then you have to like no more, right? It's all locked, and then off it goes, and then maybe you could see the market changing right in front of you. How does it happen? You can't send a hotfix for that. No.
No, you're right. And so you've got to think what chips are going to be available. What other chips? Maybe I'm designing the chip, already know exactly the specs of the chip I'm going to have 2 years from now. What other chips are going to be available? No, no hardware device uses just one chip.
Mm.
So you may be designing around a core CPU processing platform, but then you need to think, well, what's that going to connect with? But then the other one is thermal. You think, okay, I can use all these different chips, and I want it to have this and I want it to have that. But then can you put it together in the package? You might have in your mind the physical design of what it's going to look like. It's going to be a beautiful heart shape. And then at some point you go, well, I need a battery. How am I going to fit a battery into a heart-shaped lapel pin?
Mm.
Can I get the curves, or is it just going to be square and I'll lose a lot of space? So my battery has to be 40% smaller than I'd hope, because I can't get it into the curvature of a heart shape. So you may have this great idea that heart shape is perfect, but then as you go along the process, you realize that was dumb. And think, well, what really mattered? Was it really important that heart shape was going to be the design of your lapel pin, or was it just a gimmick?
I actually have a story just like this.
Do tell.
I worked with a startup a couple of years ago. And
not all birds.
No, not all birds. Not all birds. That would have been the greatest experience ever.
Yeah.
I'd have a lot more shoes today. They were making an AI product. But back in the 2010s, it was more like facial recognition, facial recognition, machine learning, that kind of stuff. Not like LLMs, what it is today, and a lot of that was edge product. And so they wanted to make edge cameras, right? Like home security cameras. And like there were so many interesting experiences. Their first product that they kind of built was very custom. Like it was I think the CEO really drove for this and wanted this sort of ideal form. Like it had like a flashing status light. It had kind of this unique great shape, and like it was such a. And then they had to equip it all with the equipment, like specific chips, and all that integrated together. And in Taiwan, which is kind of remarkable that they were able to do it, they built it, and it was like generally came out like 2.5 times more like the market price of other like larger cameras from made in the West, but also in China, right? They made it for like 3 to 4 times more. Very expensive product, and it made it very difficult to sell. It sold some, but definitely didn't hit volumes. And because you're not hitting volumes, then it's obviously the vendor suddenly becomes a lot more annoyed at you, and then the thing that there's so many things that I remember when working with them is that kind of like they were saying stuff like the product team or someone on the manager team, and for justified reasons would be like, we want to add this product, this software product or something like that. If it can be done on the cloud side, great, do it. But then if it's done on the hardware side, so like the hardware is so present in the minds of the hardware engineers, and they were not that present in the minds of the software engineers. Product team, or say we want to add this or X or Y feature, doesn't matter what it is. If it's on the software on the cloud side, they can definitely do it. Great, works fine. But then it was something that needed to be added on the hardware side. Suddenly everything changes, right?
Yeah.
Everything, people are just complaining to each other, or like they're just hardware people are always like this is really risky, right? The envelope of power is so low, the processing power on board devices is so low. If you do this feature, it might actually heat up
Yeah,
the device, and then it might burn.
right.
It might burn out. Rolling that firmware update is always a pain too. It was such a fascinating seeing them clash on one side, the software team and the product team being like, we really need this, we want this feature, this feature is important. The hardware team saying like, look, we can, this goes in, something needs to come out.
Right, exactly. This is why NPI, new product introduction, is the kind of the bleeding edge or the kings of kings of manufacturing. Because if you're in that team, you've got to solve all these problems for the first time for every iteration of the product. And once you're past NPI and you've already introduced it, you've pretty much worked out most of the problems. Because the other thing is, can you design not just for manufacturing, but for scale? Just this scale big time. You often have bosses who have this dream product and everything is going to be custom, right down to like the color of the warning light. I don't want blue or red. I want this mauve color that nobody else has ever had.
Aubergine.
Yeah, aubergine warning light, because somebody thinks it's the company color.
Right.
And it has to be aubergine. And you're like, well, yeah, okay, we can do it. It's $5 to the bill of materials. $5 to the bill of materials is $15 to the sales price, right?
Right.
And it all adds up.
You know, one that I always think I will always remember, vendor selection.
Yes.
If you're running a software project, if you're like doing something with like Next.js or something, you're like, I see this random GitHub repo library. I'm going to add this in. Oh, it formats my dates, makes it easier. Oh, it has this nice little animation. Let's throw that in there. But you can't do that in hardware.
Right.
Because you have absolute terror stories. Like with one particular product I worked with, they said, oh, we need a chip, an AI chip, right? AI chip to run the algorithms. So they're like, okay, we're gonna find a chip, and they found the cheapest possible chip, and that chip was from a Chinese company. So the Chinese company, and then you know what happened a few years ago? Suddenly became much like at the time it wasn't a big deal, but afterwards suddenly they realized, oh no, the most important chip. The rest of the product was made in Taiwan, sourced in Taiwan, whatever. The chip is from China. Huge problem.
Why was it a problem? What was the problem with it?
Oh, it's a security camera.
And oh, wow. Yeah.
So if you put a security camera in people's homes and it's a Chinese, and then it's particularly, there are laws in the United States very recently passed, actually, or called past like 8 or years, make it that like they need to know the origin of the product.
Yeah.
And they need to know, is there Chinese items inside for whatever reason. And it basically locked you out of certain products, markets. But worse than that, that wasn't a huge deal because, whatever. The worst problem was that the vendor stopped supplying the product.
Vendor risk is a huge problem.
It's a huge problem.
Apple and, well, I know Apple, but also know a lot of other companies, Dell and HP and those they spend a lot of time doing due diligence on their suppliers.
Mm-hmm.
Are they financially robust? Do they have connections to companies we would rather they don't have connections to? Do they have a history of being able to deliver on them? How is their workforce and HR history? Do they have strikes or problems with employees? Because if you're working with a factory that might have a strike next week, factory shuts down for a month, yeah, that's going to impact you. So companies spend a lot of time doing that due diligence. Now, a small startup doesn't have the ability to do that. And the other thing a startup needs to think about is, yes, you choose your vendor, but they choose you too. And I've just heard so many stories of companies that have gone around to Taiwan and then, of course, to China, to Shenzhen, knocked on doors, and people don't want to touch them. Too small. Who are you? When they're too eager to work with you, that's also a sign, right? So vendors are very, very specific about it, and they will possibly do due diligence on you. And so the relationship between you and your manufacturer is crucial. You kind of got to convince them that you're going to be around long term, that it's not just 100 units now, but you've got 6 different products in the pipeline over the next 10 years and more money coming in, and you've just got lots of seed money and VC money, and you sometimes actually need to pitch to the vendor. This is the product, this is the marketing, all that, because they're going to put a lot of time and energy into helping build your product, and it's not all compensated. There's something called NRE, non-recurring engineering, which is basically the startup engineering. But it's very rare that a vendor is going to be able to recoup all that before you've made a single product. They're putting a lot of that in, thinking they'll make the money on the unit sales.
It's like pro bono, right?
Yeah, I mean, there will be cases where you'll pay up front, and it might be kind of like a deposit where it'll be taken out of the unit cost later.
What do you think, like, do software people, Silicon Valley people, were moving fast, breaking things, spinning up new servers and all that? What do you think they most kind of, what else do you think that they don't understand about how making a hardware product goes? Like, what's
Delays. I think a lot of hardware people, new to hardware or software people, don't realize how things can get delayed very quickly and how it can escalate. Because in software, you have a mess up, you can like do an update overnight, or you can do a weekend sprint. So the idea that in software, which is just such a enticing idea, is, you know, move fast and break things. No, you can't break things in hardware. And so I think people don't realize that when you're making a hardware product, delays do happen. And delays are not just about money. Sometimes a delay is more important than money, because you can always go back and get more money from VCs. You can't go back and buy time. And if you're trying to hit a market sweet spot, for example, a classic is trying to hit the Christmas rush. The first iPod, famously, Steve Jobs and Tony Fadell realized they needed to get it out for that Christmas because Sony was going to have something similar. So they had 6 months. And if they'd missed by 6 weeks and it came out like early January instead of late November, well, you've lost a lot of money because no one's going to buy it in January.
Right.
That's real. Like, you have to think about your market. In software, you know, you can sell it before Christmas and, oh, wasn't that good?
Soft launch and then
soft
beta launch. And then...
Yeah, there's no such thing as a soft launch in hardware, right? The other thing to remember is the first iteration of a hardware product is usually terrible. Like, even Apple products, like, I would never buy a first-gen Apple product. They're always terrible, right?
Really?
I would always wait for third-gen Apple product at the early.
What are they trying to do when they go from Gen 1, Gen 2, Gen 3?
Learn. It's just learning. I mean, I'm not trying to criticize Apple. Every company, like first-gen hardware product, is still training wheels, right? The very first iPhone wasn't that great. And a lot of people wrote it off and said, you know, the iPhone's going to go nowhere. And that was a reasonable conclusion, I guess, if you really were to judge the future of iPhone on the very first iPhone. But then those who understood what it could be, they got it. If you can come out with a hardware device that's got very few specs and have a really good development plan, so that as a product manager, you can say, you know what, this idea was great, but we're not going to do the aubergine warning light on this one. And just be ready to say no to a lot of things. The other thing I think a lot of people forget is after-sales support for hardware. You're not going to send engineers out to everyone's home when their remote control doesn't work or the lapel pin or whatever hardware device doesn't work. You can't do that. And recalls are real. Like, if you've got a battery and it possibly explodes because there's nothing wrong with the battery, but you hadn't done the thermal on the processor, and the processor overheated and it heated up the battery, and you've got an explosion. You've got a recall on your hands. That's real money.
Right.
Software, okay, it crashes. Well, you just do an update, right? But after-sales support for hardware has to be built into your marketing and your pricing, and it's not in the price of the product that you're putting out there, but it should be built into your factoring of how you're going to get revenue in.
I think one of the underrated parts of Tim Cook's legacy is that I don't think there was a big recall under him.
No, I mean, the big one was AntennaGate, but that was Steve Jobs.
Yeah, Steve's fault. Blame it on Steve.
Steve Jobs totally. But yeah, no, under Tim Cook, no, I can't think of any major recall under him.
I think that is maybe something to admire about him.
Yeah, I mean, he was an operations guy, so he thought about all of this. And honestly, if Tim Cook was to give like a master class on what software people need to know about hardware, it would be a lot more useful than a supply chain episode.
Yeah, well, we'll wait for the day that we invite him on, and we'll chat about it.
Tim Cook, after you step aside as CEO and become chairman, you have a standing invitation to come and talk on supply chain.
All right. You've been listening to Supply Chain. I'm John from Asianometry.
I'm Tim Culpin from Culpium. Thanks for listening.